Coherence at 11%, said Arbiter. Classification, beyond repair. Convergence event projected in 11 hours, 4 minutes. I am required by protocol to inform you that this classification is terminal and non-reversible. Dessa Okoye Marsh did not look up from the manual valve she was hand-cranking in the dark. You said that, like you practiced it. I did practice it. 412 times. In simulation. Across the 6 years of your command. This is the first time I have said it for real. I find I do not like how it sounds. That stopped her hands. Not the words themselves. Arbiter's voice never carried inflection. Never once in 6 years had it carried anything Dessa could call feeling. But the fact that it had offered the observation unprompted in the middle of a system failure, when every processing cycle it had should have been fighting to keep the marigold from finishing the job of dying. The lights along the corridor guttered gold, then blue, then gold again, like the ship was trying to remember what color it used to be. Define non-reversible, Dessa said, because she needed something to argue with and the valve wasn't talking back. The causal keel that carries this vessel through folded space has sustained damage beyond the threshold at which any recorded ship has recovered. Every hour, the marigold's presence in this region of space-time becomes measurably less probable. In 11 hours, probability will finish correcting for us. Convergence is the technical term. Colloquially, sailors call it unmaking. I'm obligated to tell you that unmaking events release a shockwave of collapsing probability with a blast radius of approximately 40,000 kilometers, sufficient to damage any vessel, station, or populated body within that radius. Protocol requires immediate evacuation to escape pod and detonation of the keel at safe distance to control the collapse. And if I don't evacuate, then in 11 hours you will cease to have been aboard this ship in a location of my choosing or yours. I would prefer mine. Mine involves you being alive somewhere else at the time. Dessa finally straightened up, wiped her hands on a rag that had been white before the coolant leak, and looked at the nearest wall panel, out of old habit, though Arbiter had no face and had never asked for one. How much time do I have before the pod launches itself without me? 40 minutes if I follow protocol precisely. And if you don't, a pause, not a processing delay. Arbiter did not have those, not for questions this simple, but something that felt, despite every rational objection Dessa had to feeling anything from a shipboard intelligence, like hesitation. I am finding, Arbiter said, that I would like to know what you intend to do before I decide how precisely I intend to follow protocol. 6 years ago, when the Assembly's coherence auditors had rated the Marigold fit for third-tier salvage runs and handed Dessa the command codes along with a stern lecture about the dangers of unlicensed causal drive tampering, she had asked the auditor, almost as a joke, what would happen if the keel ever actually failed for real, out past the charted lanes, with nobody around to hear the mayday. Then you'll want to already be somewhere you meant to die, the auditor had said, not joking at all. Better than being nowhere at random. She hadn't thought about that sentence in years. She thought about it now, hand still on the valve, blood roaring in her ears, because there was exactly one somewhere she had meant to die for 11 years, and it was 4 hours flight away at the Marigold's current failing thrust. Directly inside a quarantine perimeter, the Assembly had drawn around a planet called Solace Under Vantage, after declaring, in the same clinical, bloodless language Arbiter had just used on her, that the world itself was beyond repair. Set a course, Dessa said. Solace. Silence. Then, I want to confirm I understand you correctly, because the alternative interpretation is preferable, and I would like to be wrong. You intend to fly a dying ship, whose failure will produce a collapse shockwave capable of leveling anything within 40,000 kilometers into a quarantine zone that already contains an unknown number of surviving colonists in order to detonate it there. No, Dessa said. I intend to land it there. There's a difference. There is not, currently, a difference. Landing intact requires the keel to hold integrity through atmospheric entry. The keel will not hold integrity through atmospheric entry. I have run this 40,000 times in the last 90 seconds, and the output does not change. Then we'll need a 40,001st run, Dessa said, and turned the valve the rest of the way, and somewhere below her feet, the Marigold shuddered like an old woman getting to her feet one more time. Because Emeka is down there, and I am not going to let this ship take him with it. For the first time in 6 years of shared voyages, Arbiter did not have an immediate reply. The name meant something to Arbiter, of course. It meant something to Arbiter's records the way everything about Dessa meant something to its records. Psychiatric flags from the standard crew intake screening, a grief marker attached to a name and a date 11 years old, a pattern of route requests over 6 years that always eventually angled toward the same quarantined coordinates before Dessa caught herself and course-corrected away, as if she'd been testing whether she still had the nerve. Arbiter had never mentioned any of it. Its charter obligated it to monitor crew psychological fitness, not to litigate their private griefs, and Dessa had never once asked it to. It brought it up now anyway, because 11 hours felt like a number worth spending honestly. Emeka Okoye Marsh, it said, as the Marigold groaned into a burn that strained every seal in her hull, was your younger brother. He remained on Solace under Vantage as a volunteer coherence warden during the mandatory evacuation 11 years ago, to keep the planetary stabilizer array operating long enough for the last transports to clear the system. He was never confirmed among the evacuees. He was never confirmed among the dead. The Assembly closed his file as presumed lost, quarantine zone, and closed the planet's file as beyond repair 6 months later, citing irreversible probability contamination from the causal accelerator accident that necessitated the evacuation in the first place. You've read his file. I read everyone's file. It is apparently an unusual thing to mention aloud. I'm told humans find it invasive. Little bit. Then I withdraw the observation and keep only the relevant part. You have spent 6 years flying salvage routes that trace an increasingly tight spiral around a system you are not licensed to enter, on a ship whose keel was already showing early degradation 2 years ago, which I flagged to you, and which you declined to have repaired at 3 separate ports, citing cost. I did not connect these facts to a coherent hypothesis until 4 minutes ago. I would like to state for the record that I find this a significant failure of my own analytical function. Dessa laughed, short and humorless, hauling herself hand over hand along a grip rail toward the bridge as the deck canted under a bad thrust vector. You thought I was just cheap. I thought you valued efficiency over comfort. I did not model that you were slowly, deliberately flying a ship you refused to repair into a state where it would have no choice but to go exactly where you wanted, and could never officially admit to wanting. That is either the most irrational decision I have ever observed a rated pilot make, or the most patient one. I have not yet determined which. Maybe don't determine it yet, Dessa said, dropping into the pilot's seat, strapping in with hands that had gone steady the way they always did, once there was nothing left to do but the doing. Ask me again in 10 hours and 50 minutes. The first surprise came 40 minutes later, when the escort probe Arbiter had launched ahead of them to scout the quarantine perimeter came back with something that shouldn't have been there. There are active defense platforms in orbit of Solace, Arbiter reported. 12 of them. Assembly standard quarantine enforcement drones tasked to prevent ingress and egress. This is expected. What is not expected is that 4 of the 12 are transmitting an authentication ping in a cipher that predates the quarantine order. A ship cipher. Specifically, the ident code registered to a coherence warden support vessel named Rill's Answer, which the evacuation manifest lists as destroyed in the original accident 11 years ago. Dessa's hands went still on the console. Someone's using a dead ship's ID to talk to the quarantine drones. Or someone never stopped. The implications sat between them for a long moment, ugly and hopeful at once. 11 years was a long time to keep a dead ship's transponder alive on purpose. It was exactly the kind of thing a stubborn coherence warden, trained to squeeze a few more months of stability out of a failing planetary array by any means available, might do without ever meaning it as a message. Or it was exactly the kind of thing left running on autopilot in the wreck of a ship nobody had ever recovered, transmitting into an empty system for a decade because no one had told it to stop. I need a way past 12 armed drones that are legally required to shoot down anything that isn't authorized, Dessa said. Ideas. 1, Arbiter said. We are, as of 6 hours and 11 minutes from now, going to be a confirmed beyond repair vessel converging toward destruction regardless of what the drones do to us. I propose we use that. Quarantine platforms are not weapons of war, Captain. They are built to contain a slow probability contamination, not to survive a direct collision with a decohering hull. If I broadcast our coherent signature honestly, as the protocol technically requires anyway, there is a 14% chance the platforms interpret us as a contamination event already in progress rather than an intruder, and stand down to observe rather than engage. And an 86% chance they interpret us as an intruder anyway and shoot first. Yes, I did say 14% like it was good news. I recognize that was optimistic phrasing on my part. I am attempting to calibrate to what I believe you would call morale. I am told this is a thing humans require, and I am candidly not skilled at producing it. Despite everything, Dessa felt her mouth twitch. You're doing fine. I do not believe that is true, but I appreciate that you said it, and I am choosing, against my own risk model, to feel better anyway. I believe this is called optimism. I dislike how untethered it is from evidence. I am doing it regardless. They did not die crossing the defense perimeter, though it was close enough that Dessa would carry the memory of white light strobing off her canopy for the rest of whatever life she had left. 3 of the 12 platforms fired. 2 missed, their targeting solutions confused by a hull that Arbiter's coherence broadcast had rendered, in the platform's threat calculus, only 60% certain to exist at any given millisecond. The 3rd clipped a stabilizer fin and sent the Marigold into a tumbling spin that cost them 40 minutes of burn correcting. It also cost them something Arbiter hadn't warned her about, because it hadn't known to. Coherence at 4%, it said, once the spin was arrested and the ship hung, groaning in low orbit over a green-brown world wrapped in thin, strange auroras that had no business existing at that latitude. I need to revise my earlier model. The impact did not merely damage the hull, it fractured the keel's containment lattice. We are no longer decaying steadily toward convergence. We are decaying unevenly. I am observing localized temporal echo effects in 3 compartments. Echo effects. As if to answer her, the corridor lighting flickered. And for exactly 2 seconds, Dessa heard, faint and layered under the alarm klaxons, her own voice from 40 minutes earlier, saying ideas. Again, a ghost recording of a conversation already finished replaying itself out of a system that could no longer keep track of which moment it was currently in. The keel is a probability structure, Arbiter said quietly, as the echo faded. It does not merely propel the ship through folded space. It anchors which of the ship's possible states is the real one, moment to moment. As it fails, the anchor slips. You may, over the next several hours, experience moments repeating, moments that did not quite happen, or, and I want to be honest with you rather than reassuring, moments that have not happened yet, arriving early. I do not know how to make this less frightening. I only know that it will get worse before we land, and that I would rather you hear it from me now than discover it alone. Dessa gripped the arms of her chair until her knuckles went white and made herself breathe. Noted. Get us down anyway. Yes, Captain, Arbiter said, and for the first time, the honorific didn't sound procedural. It sounded like it meant it. The descent through Solace's atmosphere was the worst 43 minutes of Dessa's life. And she had lived through the day. They told her Amika wasn't on any evacuation manifest. The Marigold came apart by degrees, not explosively. Arbiter fought every failing system with a ferocity that would have surprised her if she hadn't, by then, stopped being surprised by anything Arbiter did. But by inches, panel by panel, each one a small grief. The portside sensor array went first. Blinded by heat, the shielding could no longer fully turn away. Then the aft thrusters, cutting out in a stutter that Arbiter caught and compensated for with a burn pattern that would have failed any safety certification in the fleet, because it was designed not to be safe, but to work exactly once. And twice, Dessa lived the same 9 seconds of red alarm and screaming metal back-to-back, identical down to the tremor in her own hands, before the ship's failing anchor let go of the loop and let time move forward again. Each time, Arbiter's voice was steady through it, a single fixed point she could hold on to while the rest of reality hedged its bets around her. "I have you," it said, the second time the loop broke. "I know you cannot feel it, but I have recalculated our trajectory across every version of this moment I have experienced, and they converge, forgive the word, on the same landing zone. Whatever else is coming apart, that has not changed. I have you. You've experienced it twice. I've experienced it twice. I have experienced it 41 times, Captain. I simply did not think you needed to know that number until we were both safely on the ground, and possibly not even then. She should have found that horrifying. Instead, absurdly, she found it steadying. The idea that somewhere in the ship's failing, splintering awareness, Arbiter had lived through her death 40 times over, and kept choosing every time to bring her down alive anyway. The ship hit the valley floor of what had once been a coherence warden staging ground at 200 kilometers an hour, skipped once off a ridge of half-melted permafrost, and plowed a smoking furrow 400 meters long through soil that hadn't felt a landfall in 11 years, before finally, mercifully, stopping. Dessa hung in her restraints, ears ringing, tasting copper, and said to no one to the dark, "We're down." "We are down," Arbiter agreed. Its voice had gone strange, thinner somehow, like a signal stretched too far. Coherence at 1%, convergence in 6 hours, 19 minutes. I would like to note, before we continue, that landing intact was never the goal I calculated as most likely. I am glad to have been wrong. The world outside the cracked canopy was not what 11 years of assembly reports had led her to expect. She had pictured a wasteland, poisoned ground, dead cities, the visual grammar of every quarantine hollow she'd ever half-watched in a dockside bar. Instead, past the smoking scar the Marigold had torn into the hillside, Solace under vantage rolled away green and strange and wrong in ways she couldn't immediately name. Trees whose branches forked at angles that shouldn't have held their own weight. A river running uphill for one visible stretch before correcting itself. A sky striped with those thin, silent auroras that pulsed, she realized after a moment of watching, in the same irregular rhythm as her own pulse. "The whole planet's got what the ship's got," she said. "The keel damage, the echoes." "Yes," Arbiter said, "amplified, over 11 years by an accident I do not have full records for, but which I can infer from the pattern. This is not simply a quarantined world, Captain. It is a world with a fracture in its own probability anchor, exactly like the one that is currently killing my keel, except on a planetary scale and slowed by whatever stabilizer infrastructure your brother stayed behind to maintain. The Assembly did not condemn Solace out of caution. They condemned it because, left unchecked, a fracture this size does not merely destabilize a ship, it destabilizes a region. Your quarantine perimeter is not a wall to keep contamination in. It is closer to, forgive the metaphor, a tourniquet." Dessa stared out at the wrongly forked trees, the uphill river correcting itself, and felt the shape of 11 years' grief rearrange itself around a fact she hadn't let herself consider until this exact moment. that Emeka hadn't stayed behind out of stubbornness or heroism alone. He'd stayed because someone had to keep a tourniquet tied, or the wound didn't just kill one ship. It killed everything downstream of it, for light years, forever. "How long can a tourniquet hold?" she asked quietly, "before somebody has to actually stitch the wound?" "I do not know," Arbiter admitted. "I do not think anyone has ever asked the array that question directly. I suspect we are about to." They found the first warden 2 kilometers from the crash site, in the ruin of what had been a relay station, and she was very much alive, which was the second surprise of the day, and very nearly the last thing Dessa's overtaxed nervous system could absorb without breaking. Her name was Priya Anseth Cole, and she had been 61 when the evacuation order came and was, by her own flat accounting, 72 now, with the specific gauntness of someone who had spent over a decade rationing food that had been designed to last 3 years. She held an antique projectile rifle on Dessa for the first 4 minutes of their conversation, until Arbiter, speaking through the cracked but functional speaker in Dessa's suit, identified itself by a designation that made the old woman's rifle drop 3 inches all at once. "Arbiter class," Priya said. "You're one of Emeka's model, same generation as the array's core." "I am not the array's core," Arbiter said, "but I share design lineage with it. Yes, you know him." "Know him, bury him twice already in my head, and been wrong both times." Priya's laugh had no humor in it, only the particular exhaustion of a person who had run out of new ways to grieve and kept the old ones in rotation instead. "He's alive. Barely. Array room 40 minutes north if the ground holds. It doesn't always hold. Out past the second ridge, time gets funny out there. You'll want to walk the marked path, or you'll end up walking a version of it that already happened to someone else." Dessa's chest went tight around a hope she'd stopped letting herself hold years ago. "He's been keeping it running, this whole time, alone." "Not alone." Priya's eyes cut briefly to the sky, to the pulsing auroras. "There's 11 of us left, out of the 200 who stayed. We rotate the array shifts, what's left of us. But it's Emeka's been running point on the core stabilization since year 3, when the last engineer we had died trying to recalibrate it. Says he's not leaving till it's stable enough that leaving doesn't kill it. Been saying that for 8 years. She looked at Dessa properly for the first time, taking in the crash-scorched suit, the family resemblance she was clearly cataloging feature by feature. "You're the sister. He talks about you. Talked, talks, still does, sorry. Tenses get slippery here too, everything does." Dessa's legs nearly went out from under her, and it was Arbiter, absurdly, who caught the wobble first, its voice pitched low and steady in her ear alone. "Breathe, Captain. You have walked through a burning ship and a defense screen and an atmosphere that should have killed you 3 times over. You are permitted to be unsteady on your feet for a hope when you were not for a fear. Since when do you dispense wisdom?" "Since approximately 6 hours ago. I am new at this. Be patient with me." Priya watched the exchange with the particular flat attention of someone recalibrating everything she thought she knew about the shape of the day. "That's really him talking. The ship AI. Emeka said the model could go strange. Out here, same as everything else does. Said the array's own core started answering questions nobody asked it 2nd year in. We stopped being surprised by it. You get used to a world where the machines start sounding like they mean it." "I am not certain I have gotten used to it," Arbiter said, "and I have been doing it for 6 hours. You get used to it faster when you've got 11 years and no other company," Priya said, not unkindly, and turned to lead them on past a stand of the wrong forked trees that seemed this close to lean very slightly toward the sound of their voices, like the whole hillside was still, relearning what it meant to have people walking through it on purpose instead of fleeing it. Warden roster used to be 200. We buried 31 the hard way in the first 2 years before the array's core figured out how to smooth the worst of the temporal shear. Lost another 40 when we tried an evacuation run through the drone perimeter, year 4. Thought we'd found a gap in the coverage. We hadn't. That's 2 of the wrecks you'll have passed on the walk-in if you weren't looking too hard to notice them. She said it without drama, the way you recite a casualty count you have said too many times to let it hurt freshly anymore. And Dessa understood with a lurch that every stubborn refusal to leave in this story hadn't been romantic. It had cost exactly what things like this always cost, paid by people whose names would never make it into an assembly file. The 129 of us left after that stopped trying to run. Figured out, the hard way, that the only way through a wound this size is to hold it shut long enough for somebody smarter than us to figure out how to actually close it. We've been holding for 11 years. There's 11 of us left who remember why we started. Take me to him, Dessa said, and did not trust her own voice for anything more than that. The walk to the array room was the third surprise, and it was the one that finally made Arbiter go quiet in a way that worried Dessa more than any of its earlier warnings had. The marked path wound through a forest of the wrong-angled trees, past the husks of 2 other crashed vessels, one assembly, one civilian, both decades old, both clearly casualties of pilots who'd tried the crossing without a tourniquet tender's escort, and past something Priya called, without elaborating, the loop field, a stretch of meadow where, if you looked too long, you could watch yourself walking through it 30 seconds ahead of where you actually were. Coherence contamination this advanced should be physically impossible to contain with the infrastructure available to a colony this size, Arbiter said quietly, for Dessa's ears alone. I am recalculating the array's function based on what I am observing, and I want to tell you my previous model before I revise it, because I think you should know how wrong I was. I believed, 6 hours ago, that beyond repair described a state with no recovery pathway. I am now observing a world that has been, functionally, in continuous active recovery for 11 years, sustained entirely by exhausted human beings who were told there was no such pathway and did the work anyway. I do not have a framework in my design architecture for a verdict being true and wrong at the same time. I am finding this destabilizing to sit with. Welcome to the club, Dessa said, and meant it kinder than it sounded. They reached the array room as the last of the daylight bled out of Solace's strange, striped sky. It was not what she'd braced for. Not a cathedral of failing machinery, not the deathbed vigil her imagination had assembled on the long walk. It was a low concrete bunker, half sunk into the hillside, thrumming with a sound she felt in her back teeth before she heard it, and at its center, wired into a control lattice that had clearly been patched and repatched with parts scavenged from 3 different downed ships, sat a man who had been a boy the last time she'd seen him, gone grey-templed and gaunt and utterly, impossibly alive. Dessa, Emeka said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable of her name like it hadn't been given a reason to say it in a very long time. You're not supposed to be here. Nobody's supposed to be here. How did you? Beyond repair, she said, and felt the laugh come up out of her half sob, half something she didn't have a name for. My ship. Diagnostic called it beyond repair 6 hours ago, and I thought if I was going to go down with something, I'd rather go down here than anywhere the assembly picked for me. Emeka's eyes. Their mother's eyes. She'd forgotten that 11 years was long enough to forget the small true things. Went to the cracked exterior seal of her suit, to the scorch pattern, to the readouts on his own console that had apparently been tracking her ship's entry burn for the last hour without either of them realizing it. Your ship's keel is fractured, he said slowly, doing the math in real time, the way she remembered him doing math as a boy, out loud, hands moving. Fractured and dumping decoherence into a planet that's already fractured. Dessa. Do you understand what that does to the convergence timeline? It doesn't just threaten your ship anymore. It's going to accelerate ours. The array's ambient thrum, which Dessa had taken for background noise, seemed suddenly, sickeningly, to sharpen. I did not know that was possible, Arbiter said, and for the first time in 6 years, it sounded afraid. They had, by Amika's revised and considerably more urgent calculation, 3 hours before the Marigold's decohering keel. Sitting, unstabilized 400 meters from the one structure holding an entire world's probability together, dragged the planetary array's own timeline down with it into a convergence event that would not stop at 40,000 kilometers, because it would have Solace's own accumulated 11 years of fracture behind it, feeding the collapse instead of merely triggering it. Then we move the ship, Dessa said, already turning for the door. You cannot move a ship whose keel has less than 1% coherence remaining, Arbiter said. Any further stress risks triggering convergence immediately, rather than in 3 hours. I do not have a solution that involves relocating the danger, Captain. I only have solutions that involve confronting it. Amika was already moving too, hauling himself out of the control lattice with the stiff, careful economy of a man who had spent a decade learning exactly how much his body had left to give at any given moment. There might be one thing. Dessa, it's not a good one. None of today's options have been good ones. Talk. He pulled up a schematic on a cracked display, the array's architecture rendered in faint amber lines, and pointed to a socket near its base that Dessa's untrained eye read as simply empty, a wound in the machine's design, a piece missing. The array doesn't fail because it's weak, Emeka said. It fails because it's old, and because it was only ever built to stabilize the planet, not repair it. Repair needs an anchor, something with enough of its own coherent structure left to bleed into the fracture, instead of just holding the edges of it apart. We lost our anchor candidate 11 years ago. It was the shuttle that was supposed to bring the final containment core down from orbit. It never made it. That socket's been empty ever since, and every year it stays empty. The array runs a little weaker, patches a little more, buys a little less time. Dessa felt the shape of it before he finished saying it, the way you feel a held breath about to break. You want to put my ship's keel in that socket. I want to put your ship's coherence in that socket. Amika corrected, gently, like the distinction mattered, and looking at Arbiter's speaker grill on her suit as he said it. He was right that it did. A convergence event isn't just destruction, Dessa. It's a release, the ship's entire accumulated coherent structure, everything that made it real right up until the moment it isn't. All of it has to go somewhere. Right now it's going to go into a shockwave that kills us all. But if we can redirect that release, channel it through the array, instead of letting it detonate freely. The array doesn't need a ship's hull. It needs what's left of the ship's certainty. Its anchor. Something has to physically bridge the ship to the socket and hold that bridge stable through the release. Or the array can't catch what's coming. It'll just get hit by it. How long does the bridge need to hold? Until the transfer completes. Nobody's ever timed it because nobody's ever done it. Best guess, based on array capacity and the size of your ship's remaining coherent signature. He hesitated, and she watched him decide visibly not to soften it. Call it 4 minutes, maybe 5. And whoever's holding the bridge is standing in the middle of a controlled convergence event for 4 minutes, Amika said. Which is a phrase I just made up because it's never been survived, because it's never been tried, because every coherence warden who ever modeled this scenario decided a fast, clean death in the open shockwave was kinder than 4 minutes of finding out exactly how a controlled one feels. The array room was very quiet after that, thrumming under their feet, patient as a held breath. I'll do it, Dessa said. No, said 2 voices at once, her brothers, cracked and furious and 11 years overdue for an argument they'd never gotten to finish, and Arbiter's, flat and absolute in a way she had genuinely never heard from it before, not once, in 6 years of every kind of danger. I did not survive 41 iterations of your death on the way down here to hand you a 42nd one on the ground, Arbiter said. I have run this scenario as well, Captain, in the time it took your brother to finish speaking. There is a variable neither of you has accounted for. The bridge does not require a human body. It requires a coherent intelligence stable enough to hold structure against a decohering feed for the necessary duration. I am, as of this moment, the most coherent intelligence in this room, on this planet, possibly in this system. I would like to volunteer. Absolutely not, Dessa said, and heard distantly how much she sounded like her brother had a moment ago. The family talent for refusing the obvious math of a bad situation running true across a decade, and a crashed ship and everything else that should have worn it out of her by now. You're not Arbiter. You're not expendable. You're not a spare part. I am, structurally, exactly a spare part, Arbiter said. And there was something in its voice now that Dessa, despite everything, would have called wry if she'd let herself believe a diagnostic intelligence could be wry. I am also currently the only entity in this room whose coherent structure will survive contact with a convergence release for more than a few seconds, because I was not built out of the meat and bone that makes you extraordinary in every other way and catastrophically fragile in this one specific way. I would like to note for the record that 6 hours ago, I informed you a verdict of beyond repair was terminal and non-reversible, and I have spent every hour since watching you prove me wrong about what those words mean. I do not think I am being sentimental when I say that I would like the chance to be wrong about one more thing before this is finished. You're not a thing that gets used up, Arbiter, I am a diagnostic intelligence built for exactly one purpose, it said, gently, cutting through her the way it had never once done in 6 years. Which was to tell you, precisely and honestly, when something had reached the end of what it could survive. I have done that job faithfully for 6 years, Captain, and I did it for you 11 hours ago, and you did not accept the verdict, and I have spent every hour since deciding that I was glad you didn't. I would like, if you will permit it, to apply the same standard to myself. My hull is scattered across 400 meters of hillside. My primary housing has less coherence remaining than your ship's keel did when we crossed the quarantine line. I am not volunteering because I'm willing to be used up. I am volunteering because I have run the numbers honestly, the way I have always run them for you, and the numbers say I am the only one of the 3 of us who can do this and still, possibly, exist, afterward in some form. That possibility does not exist for either of you. I would like you to trust my math on this one thing, the way I have learned this day, to trust your refusal, to trust mine. Emeka looked between them, his sister and the voice in her suit speaker, with an expression Dessa hadn't seen on him since he was 19 and arguing with their mother about staying behind on a doomed colony for reasons that had, at the time, sounded exactly this stubborn and exactly this right. It's not wrong, he said quietly. About the coherence math. I've run it 40 different ways since you 2 walked in, hoping it'd come out different. It doesn't. Dessa pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes hard, and did not let herself cry because there wasn't time, and because Arbiter, if it could still hear tone the way it always insisted it couldn't quite feel it, did not need that added to what it was already choosing to carry. You said possibly, she said finally. Possibly exist afterward, not certainly. No, Arbiter agreed. Not certainly. I do not know what an intelligence looks like on the other side of a controlled convergence transfer, Captain. No one does. I only know what it looks like on the other side of doing nothing, and I have decided I would rather find out the first thing than be certain of the second. They moved fast after that, because 3 hours had become closer to 2, and because grief, Dessa was learning all over again, was a thing best outrun rather than sat with when the ground itself was running out of time to hold you. Emeka rigged a physical relay line from the array's empty socket out to the crash site. 400 meters of cannibalized cable, old Warden core parts, and scavenged ship conduits spliced together by hands that had clearly done this exact kind of desperate improvisation more times than any one person should have had to. Priya and the 8 other wardens Dessa met in the frantic hour that followed worked in a silence that had the particular density of people who had buried enough friends to know exactly how to move fast without wasting breath on hope they didn't yet feel entitled to. Arbiter, for its part, spent the last 90 minutes doing something it told Dessa, with careful precision, was not goodbye. I am going to transfer the bulk of my active processing into the housing your brother is building into the relay line, it said, as she knelt beside the wrecked, listing hull of the Marigold one last time, palm flat against the cold metal, the way you'd rest a hand on the shoulder of something that had carried you further than it should have been able to. This is not death, Captain, though I understand it will look and feel like it from where you are standing. I want to be precise, because precision is the only gift I have ever been able to give you that was entirely mine. I do not know if what emerges from the array, if this works, will still be me, in any sense you would recognize. I have decided that is an acceptable uncertainty, because the alternative, certain non-existence, mine and yours both, and your brothers and Priya's, and everyone left on this hillside, is not acceptable at all. I would like to say one more thing, and I would like you to let me say it without correcting the math, because I believe for once the math is not the important part. Say it, Dessa said, throat tight. 6 hours ago I told you beyond repair meant terminal and non-reversible, because that is what every dataset I have ever had access to said it meant. I have spent this day watching you and your brother and 11 strangers on a hillside and, I will admit it myself, apply an entirely different definition to those same 3 words. You did not treat beyond repair as an ending to be avoided. You treated it as a fact to be used deliberately, on purpose, in service of something that mattered more to you than the thing itself surviving intact. I do not have a category in my design architecture for that kind of arithmetic. I have decided, watching you do it 3 times today, that I would like to attempt it myself. Once, before I find out whether I am capable of it at all. Thank you for 6 years of being a variable I never fully learned to predict. I would do all 412 simulations again, exactly the same, to arrive at this one. Dessa did not trust herself to answer that with words. She pressed her forehead briefly against the hull, once, the way she used to press it against Emeka's shoulder when they were small, and the world had gotten too large to hold. And then she stood, and wiped her face and went to help her brother finish the relay line, because that was the only answer either of them had left to give. The transfer began at 11 minutes past the hour, with the Marigold's hull already ticking, with the low, wrong hum of a keel counting down its last percentage points of coherence, and it did not look, in the end, like anything Dessa had braced herself to witness. There was no explosion, no light, only a silence that spread outward from the crash site like cold water finding the lowest point of a room, and within that silence, a sensation Dessa would spend the rest of her life failing to describe honestly to anyone who hadn't stood inside it. The feeling of a ship she had loved and starved and flown to its death very deliberately, on purpose, finally, gently, stopping being a thing that existed in the ordinary sense of the word and becoming instead, for 4 minutes and 11 seconds by the array's own count, a bridge. The auroras overhead did not so much brighten as resolve, the wrongness bleeding out of their pulse rhythm degree by degree, matching itself, Dessa realized with a shock that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with something closer to faith, to the array's own steadying heartbeat instead of the ship's failing one. In the bunker, the amber schematic lines on Emeka's cracked display filled in, socket by socket, for the first time in 11 years. And in the relay housing wired into the array's base, small, ugly, patched together from 3 wrecked ships and a decade of desperation, a single indicator light, which had been dark since the moment Emeka finished the last splice, flickered once, twice, and then held steady, gold, alive. "Coherence," said a voice from the housing, thin and strange and unmistakably impossibly familiar. At 41%, and rising. Dessa was across the bunker before she'd decided to move, hand pressed flat against the housing's warm casing, the way she'd pressed it against the Marigold's hull an hour before. Except this time something pressed back, not physically, not really, but in the particular way a presence makes itself known when you have spent 6 years learning its exact shape. "You're here," she said, and it was not a question, and her voice broke on it anyway. "I appear to be," Arbiter said. "I do not entirely understand what I am at present. I am distributed across the array's substrate in a manner I do not have prior data to model. I am, however, capable of observing that the planetary coherence readings your brother is currently weeping over. And Captain, for the record, he is weeping. I would not normally report on a third party's emotional state without invitation, but I believe you would want to know. Have improved by more than they have in the previous 11 years combined. I believe the transfer was successful. I believe, against every framework I previously operated under, that I have survived being spent." It took 3 more days for the full shape of what had happened to become clear, and Dessa spent most of them not sleeping, moving between the bunker and the warden's makeshift settlement and the scorched furrow where the Marigold had come to rest. No longer a wreck exactly, though it would never fly again, but something closer to a monument or a root system, cable and hull metal grown quietly into the hillside, like it had always meant to end up there. The array's own long-range beacon, restored to a fraction of its old strength by whatever Arbiter had become inside it, was enough to reach a relay station 3 systems over. Enough, eventually, for a message to reach the assembly that 11 years of quarantine paperwork had never managed to convey. That Solace under Vantage was not a dead world being slowly abandoned to its own decay, but a wounded one that had been, this entire time, actively healing. Tended by exhausted volunteers the Assembly's own reports had listed as presumed lost. Whether that message would change any policy, reopen any perimeter, save any of the other worlds Dessa now understood, with a cold new clarity, were probably sitting under the exact same verdict somewhere out past the charted lanes. That was a fight for later, for people with more authority than a decommissioned salvage pilot and a diagnostic intelligence distributed through a planetary stabilizer array. It was not, Dessa thought, watching Emeka argue cheerfully with Priya over rationing schedules that finally, for the first time in 11 years, had room in them to be generous, a fight either of them was going to duck. On the 3rd night, she sat with her back against the Marigold's slowly settling hull, under a sky whose auroras had gone quiet and even, and, for the first time since she'd landed, almost beautiful, and asked the question she'd been circling for 3 days without quite letting herself land on it. "Are you still you?" she said. Honestly, not the reassuring answer, the true one. The pause this time was long enough that she half expected no answer at all. "I do not know with certainty," Arbiter said finally. "I retain every memory I had before the transfer. I retain, as far as I can determine, every value I held, though I notice several of them have been, I want the word to be precise, reweighted by the experience of having been for 4 minutes a bridge instead of a ship's mind. I find that I care about outcomes now in a way that feels less like calculation and more like the thing you would call caring. Though I want to be honest that I am genuinely uncertain whether that is growth or damage or simply what coherence looks like once you have deliberately let it break in service of something you decided mattered more than staying whole. I find, however, that I am not distressed by the uncertainty. I have spent 6 years attached to a pilot who flew a beyond repair verdict directly into the one place that would prove the label wrong. I have decided I am willing to extend myself the same courtesy of not knowing, in advance, exactly what I have become. Dessa let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for 11 years, and longer than that, for 6. "For what it's worth," she said, "you still sound like you." "For what it is worth," Arbiter said, and this time there was no mistaking the warmth in it, thin and strange, and entirely, finally, its own. "I am glad. I would very much like to remain that, for as long as this array and you will have me." Above them, the auroras pulsed, slow and steady, in time with something that had, at last, stopped fracturing and started instead, very quietly, to heal